மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.
So to Weatherly Benjamin now, and we quickly get the contours of the modern variation where white brings his knight out to f3. Still by far the most common choice at top levels. White contents himself with a very modest approach to the opening, just sensible development. He's going to castle quickly. He's going to attack the black knight as and when he feels it's right with the move c2, c4. Note that he may not play c2, c4 at all, but that's certainly an option always to be kept in mind. Okay, and now we see Benjamin employing the Miles variation, which I'm going to be recommending later on, whereby black takes on e5, drawing white's knight into the centre of the board, and then he plays his pawn up to c6, which doesn't look like much, frankly. I mean, when you first see the move, you think, what's that? You know, it doesn't really do very much. But in fact, it's a very flexible idea. Black commits himself to nothing. Again, he's trying to find the best way of playing knight d7 without allowing that dreaded sacrifice on f7. Just to run you through that one more time. If knight d7 immediately, which I believe to be the most logical move, if black can play it, then white has knight takes f7. And then queen h5 check. Very dangerous. I mean, it may be playable if you've got a photographic memory with black, but for all normal people, I would avoid this position, frankly. So, going back, c6 prepares knight d7, I would say, dependent on white's response. And it also, if necessary, gives the black knight a square on c7, which, you know, as the course of this game shows, is quite a useful option. Well, there are many moves that white can play in this position. We'll be touching on each of them a bit later on. But for the time being, Weatherly plays bishop e2, which I think is actually one of the best moves. Once again, white doesn't try to refute black's opening. He just develops his pieces sensibly, prepares to castle, and just says to black, well, you show me how you're going to equalise. I've got more space in the centre. I've got easy development for my pieces, so you demonstrate to me what you are doing. And, well, it must be said, bishop e2 is one of white's best moves here. However, Benjamin played g6, sewing another string to black's bow. Black could have played knight d7 straight away, but g6 is a decent move. White castles. Bishop comes to g7. And now white avails himself of the opportunity to play c4. Now, the reason I chose this game was I believed that it actually demonstrated a method of play for white which a lot of your opponents are actually going to choose. And so it's very, very instructive to see how black reacts against typical methods. Well, I suppose you could say c4 is the main idea of the whole modern variation. White must just get the timing right, that's all. And normally, you see, after c4, black would have to put his knight on b6. But in this particular variation, black can change the play very slightly here and play his knight to c7. And you might say to me, well, knight c7 is a pretty poor square for the knight, isn't it? Well, just wait and see, because Benjamin manages to use that knight very usefully in the fight against white's centre a little later on in this game. So let's reserve judgment on the move knight c7 for the time being. Just let's say that in this particular variation, the d4 square is rather soft. And black might be looking to concentrate his fire against that pawn a little later on with the help of moves like knight e6. And then the knight on e5 starts to feel a little bit insecure. So there are pros and cons to the move c4. Even though for the time being it does look rather promising for white. And Weatherly continues to follow his moves, his space-gaining move in the centre up very sensibly by playing bishop to e3. I mean, what could be more sensible than that? Black castles, and white completes the development of his minor pieces by knight c3. So far, so good. It all looks fine for white. And I'm sure if you gave this position to a typical player and said, evaluate it, he would say, well, white has to be a bit better because he's got more space. And that's it. All right, well, now Benjamin employs another typical idea for this line, knight to d7. Logic of this move is impeccable. White's knight has already moved twice. black is attempting to exchange that knight off for a piece that's only moved once. So if white, for instance, were to take on d7 in this position, that would be a pretty insipid way of handling the position, because black would simply recapture, and then he gains a whole tempo by those means. So knight takes d7 is, I would say, unambitious at the very least, and leads to equality for black. No, in my view, Weatherly employs the right move in this position. He retreats his knight to f3, and you'll see this is a typical idea in this particular variation, where white's got more space, so he keeps the pieces on the board. Okay, that's positional logic. But it has to be remembered that this is the third time this knight has moved. So I suppose you could say that black is catching up in development. Okay, white is playing the right moves, but knight d7 gains time then for black, if that is the case. However, black's still got to prove equality, because the white position looks very coherent at this moment in time. Anyway, Benjamin plays b6. He's got to find some way of developing his queen side. He's got to find some way of relieving what seems to be a cramped position. So he plays b6. And now white just makes... I think the first move which we could argue with, rook to c1, I'm not sure I understand that move fully. Just going back, possibly I would have chosen queen d2 here. Possibly rook e1. I'm not sure. These moves are a question of taste. But I think we're already getting to a point in the game where perhaps Weatherly can't quite see where he's going. So he just makes as useful a move as he can find. He's hoping that rook c1 is going to prove useful a little later on. And obviously it's not a damaging move. You know, it's a decent enough move. White brings his rook to the centre. You can already see that white's being given plenty of rope. He's being allowed to develop his pieces more or less as he pleases. And this is a useful tactic in chess sometimes, giving your opponent plenty of chances to go wrong. It's very dangerous against a really strong player, because the chances of him going wrong are not that high. But here, you know, the Grandmaster's playing black. Rook c1 might be a small imprecision. At any rate, bishop b7 was the answer. We expected that move. And now white played queen to d2. Okay, it all seems really quite fine for white. And now black makes the first challenge, real challenge on the white centre with c5. I mean, it had to come. In these hypermodern openings, reactive openings, where you're encouraging the guy to do things, then you hit back, which is more or less the philosophy of the Alekhine defence. At some stage, you've got to hit back against white centre. You can't remain passive eternally, or you're going to end up with nothing to do. So black's seeking counterplay with the move c5. And once again, white plays what appears to be the most correct move, pawn up to d5, gaining space and just blocking in the bishop on b7. But now Benjamin plays what I think is the first really instructive move of the game. He plays pawn up to e5. Perhaps a slightly unexpected move, but very logical nonetheless. Now already we see a black plan taking shape. What black would very much like to do is put his knight on d6 in this position. So he's certainly thinking about rerouting that knight on c7 to come to d6. If he can get that knight to d6, then he's going to have a pretty good game automatically. It's very common in positions of this type to blockade the d pawn on d5 with a knight on d6. So that's the first idea that black has. Second idea is pretty clear. Black wants to play f5 at the right moment, and by so doing get a mobile central pawn majority together. And of course that will be very dangerous for white. If black can get the pawns abreast on e5 and f5, then he's going to have pretty good chances there against the exposed white pieces. You can just see the pawns attacking the knight on f3 or the bishop on e3. So that is black's plan. And how is Weatherly going to fight against that plan? I mean, I don't think taking on e6 is very promising in this position. Black simply recaptures with a knight. Then he's got open diagonals for his bishops. He's got a nice knight on e6. The passive black knight on c7 is passive no longer. It's on a beautiful square. And Both sides have respective outposts in the centre. White has d5, black has d4. But at any rate, taking on e6 again leads to nothing for white in my view. So Weatherly plays knight to g5, which again is an interesting move. And clearly he is trying to dissuade black from playing the move f5. And his idea is if h6 is played in this position, knight e4, and there are a few problems for black here. For instance, h6 is on pre. The knight may come to d6. White's got f4 in the wings. That pawn on h6 is not particularly attractive. So knight g5 is a very combative move. I mean, one of the things I liked about this game when I first saw it was the combative approach of the white player. You know, he wasn't going to lay down and die in the face of the grandmaster playing black. He was willing to get stuck in and play a fighting game. But at any rate, I think it's possible he may have been surprised by black's response, because knight g5, if knight g5 was designed to prevent the move f5, well, here Joel Benjamin just plays that move. And now a very sharp position arises. Well, that's the move black wants to play. The question is, can he do it? The e6 square seems to be beckoning, which I'm sure was white's idea when he played d6. I'm pretty sure white looked at the position before knight g5 and thought, well, he can't play f5 because I can just go d6 and then put my knight in on e6. So now we get a fourth sequence, a very interesting sequence, which obviously required some prior calculation, and which obviously, again, Benjamin had analysed in advance. There's only one move for black now to avoid losing material, and that is the move f4. Now we get a very sharp sequence. Well, the bishop on e3 is trapped. Having come this far, white's got to take on c7. And now black's idea here was queen takes g5. Not only continuing to attack the bishop on e3, but threatening mate on g2. So once again, white's response is completely forced here. He's got to play pawn up to f3. And, well, the idea is if black takes on e3 in this position, white can take on d7. It's still not at all clear that this position is turning out in black's favour, but Benjamin played knight f6. And once again, white's response is forced. He has to play his bishop back to f2. Well, I think probably around this stage, Weatherly was beginning to rue the fact that he'd gone knight g5, because you take a look around the position and you think to yourself, well, hang on a minute, this position is okay for white, but what about that pawn on c7? So everything's going to hinge on whether white can actually keep that pawn on c7 protected. If he can't, then he's just going to go a pawn down for nothing. And indeed, it's hard to see, looking at the position, how he's going to do so. I mean, maybe he could play knight b5 and then knight d6. Perhaps white was entertaining some hopes of doing that. But black's next move is very, very good. And I would say more or less refutes what white started out to do when he played knight g5. The excellent move e4 was played by Benjamin. And that, of course, again forces white's hand. White can't leave the pawn structure as it is. He's got to take on e4, I think. Or play some sort of intermediate move first. I mean, I think Weatherly was perhaps starting to panic in this position because the move he played doesn't look that great. Pawn up to h4. I guess he did it because perhaps he felt in the long run he wanted to give his king a flight square. But all in all, that move is pretty weakening. Probably he was just shocked by the way that position had exploded in his face. I mean, 10 moves ago, you couldn't have imagined that black would get such an active game. But with accurate countermeasures, Benjamin's achieved a pretty fantastic attacking position. So h4 is more a product of shock than anything else, I believe. And after that, queen e5 was the excellent reply. Well, now white's got to take on e4. He took with the pawn, black took with the knight. Knight takes e4, bishop takes e4. By playing this way, of course, black has taken away the idea of knight b5 entirely. He's exchanged off white's potentially most dangerous piece. And now he can look forward to gobbling that pawn on c7. It really is as simple as that. You know, white's got weaknesses all over the place. He's got a weak pawn on b2, he's got a weak pawn on c7, and finally he's got a weak pawn on g2. Corresponding weaknesses are hard to find for black. So the opening has gone in black's favour, remarkably, and seemingly out of nowhere. Appearances are very deceptive in this line. This is what white's got to guard against, a sense of overconfidence. It looks as though after 5c6 he can get the better game with ease, but in fact it doesn't turn out that way. Well, now just to continue with this particular game, as you can see, white's already got big problems with his pawns. He's going to lose something. He tried bishop to f3, but unfortunately that of course further weakens his king position. And after bishop takes on f3, the simple capture followed by a capture on c7, it has to be said that white appears to be a pawn down for very little compensation here. Queen c2 was played. Black brought his queen up to e5. I think that move not only centralises the piece, but, you know, black certainly has designs on the h-pawn in this position, as we'll see. Black perhaps intends moves like queen over to h5, then bishop f6, gobbling the h-pawn. And once the h-pawn goes, the white king is obviously going to be completely at black's mercy. So, well, en passant, the pawn at b2 was en prise, b3 was played. Black brings his last piece into play, rook a, e8. And from this point in, Benjamin makes the game of chess look very simple. Black has achieved his winning position. It's now a question of technique and patience and judgment. In winning positions, try to play without risk. So in general, black is trying to play as simply as possible now. He starts with a rook centralisation. White tries to counter by bringing his own rook into the game. Queen comes across to h5, as discussed already. Queen comes to d3, and now bishop f6 puts black's plan into practice. And it really is as simple as that. You know, black is coming over and taking off that pawn, and there isn't a great deal white can do about it. I mean, Weatherly would not have wanted to play his next move, queen d5 check, swapping off the queens in this position, but he just could not see a way of preventing black from taking the h-pawn. But of course this is a pretty miserable try. White's trying to bail out in some sort of pawn down ending, but it really is pretty hopeless. And black kept it simple, just exchanged off some pieces, brought his rook to d8. This really is a pretty horrible position for white now. White tried rook e4. He couldn't see any other way of holding his pawn. I mean, just going back, if he tries rook d1 in this position, I think black has bishop d4, if I'm not mistaken. I think that move is pretty emphatic, pretty clear cut. If white takes on d4, black just takes on d5, and that will be another pawn into the black bank. So pretty convincing and easy to understand stuff. Rook e4, rook takes d5 was played, rook takes f4, and now black is just very happy to exchange pieces. As I said, keeping it very, very simple, and well, the win shouldn't be too far away. Okay, well, white tried a few more moves. I mean, they're not really great moves, but he's got to do something. Again, black kept it very, very simple after a3. Rook comes across to f5. That's an excellent move. It just exposes all of white's weaknesses. Again, if white refrains from exchanging pieces here, pawn on f3 drops. So the long and the short of that move was that white was unfortunately dragged into a lost king and pawn ending. And yes, it really is quite simple. Here we go. King comes up. b5. Black's win in this position stems from the fact that he's got an extra pawn on the queen side. Eventually that will be the deciding factor. White tried a4 to try and disjoint the black pawn majority. a6 was played. An exchange of pawns and move 40. White resigned this position. Probably the time control had been reached, and well, it really is all over. I mean, the extra pawn counts. Let's just take play on a couple more moves to show you what might happen. There we are. It's very, very simple. Black's king is just going to dominate the centre of the board, and black will win with his extra pawn. White's king has to come across to guard the queen side pawn majority. Black's king invades on the king side and takes off the white pawns. So that was a pretty good game to start off our excursion into Alekhine's defence. And in my view, a typical game. White played what seemed to be very decent moves all the way through, but was outgunned. And, well, I hope that inspired you. Let's carry on now.
மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. தேங்க்யூ.